Hey guys, tonight we are setting ourselves down along the slow curve of the Nile, where reeds whisper in the breeze and flickering lamps send shadows dancing on mud brick walls. You imagine yourself barefoot, the air still warm from the day's sun, the river carrying both fish and stories in its endless current. It's peaceful until you realize that in a world without television, smartphones, or even a deck of playing cards, you'd better hope someone has an idea for passing the time. Spoiler: you probably won't survive an Egyptian evening without inventing some form of entertainment, or at least joining in before boredom swallows you whole. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You settle on the riverbank, watching as families begin to gather in courtyards and under awnings. Someone lays out a square board scratched crudely into limestone, while another places little pebbles at the starting line. Children squabble over whose turn comes first, while adults chuckle knowingly, because board games in Egypt weren't just a children's diversion, they were a nightly ritual. The Nile has a rhythm, and so did Egyptian life. Days were dictated by the flooding, planting, and harvest, but evenings, those belonged to games. Mainstream historians agree that the Egyptians were among the very first to invent structured board games, with Senet being the most famous example. These boards appear as early as 3100 BCE, scratched into tomb walls or carved into slabs, showing how deeply woven play was into culture. But here's a quirky tidbit. Archaeologists have found casual game boards etched into the steps of temples, suggesting priests might have passed slow hours by rolling sticks and moving counters, possibly hiding their fun under a cloak of ritual practice. Imagine sneaking in a round of Candy Crush during a sermon, but on stone. Historians still argue whether early Egyptian games were invented purely for fun, or if they carried deeper symbolic meanings from the beginning. Was Senet born as light-hearted entertainment that later absorbed spiritual weight? Or was it always meant as a miniature rehearsal for the afterlife, where winning meant navigating obstacles to eternal peace? The truth remains buried in the sands, debated like rules no one quite remembers. As you sit in this imagined courtyard, you hear laughter, see small hands pushing tokens across squares, and notice how the board itself becomes a gathering place. Here, under the glow of oil lamps, Egyptians learned to play, to argue gently over rules, to laugh at mistakes, and to pass the time when the work of the day was done. The Nile flows steadily beside you, but tonight, it is not harvests or trade that matter. It is the scratch of a stick against limestone, the click of pebbles moved square by square, and the timeless human need to play a game before drifting into sleep. The board in front of you isn't fancy, just a rough rectangle of squares, 30 in all, carved carefully into stone or painted on a wooden plank. This is Senet, the earliest and most enduring of Egyptian board games. You lean closer, noticing how the squares march across the board in 3 neat rows of 10, a pattern both simple and strangely hypnotic. Mainstream history tells us that Senet appears in Egypt as early as the First Dynasty, over 5,000 years ago. Archaeologists have found fragments of these boards in tombs, etched into walls, even scratched into paving stones, where workers or priests must have played during long pauses. The rules, however, have not survived with the same clarity. We have the board, we have the tokens, and we even have depictions of people mid-game. But the instructions? Those were apparently whispered from player to player and never written down. Classic. The quirky tidbit here is that some boards weren't carved at all. Instead, Egyptians would sketch the 30 squares into patches of mud or sand, playing with whatever pebbles or bits of reed they could find. It was portable fun before travel edition existed. Imagine a family picnic by the Nile, kids yelling about who cheated, while a stern grandmother insists that her house rules are the only valid ones. Some things never change. Historians still argue whether Senet began as a purely secular pastime or if religious meaning clung to it almost immediately. The game shows up in tomb paintings where the deceased is depicted playing against invisible opponents, hinting that Senet might have symbolized the soul's journey through the afterlife. But did ordinary laborers in the villages think of their games that way? Or were they simply trying to win bragging rights over neighbors? The debate lingers, and maybe that ambiguity is part of its charm. You pick up one of the pieces, perhaps a small cone-shaped pawn or a spindle-shaped token. They clack softly against the board, and you realize the sound itself becomes part of the ritual. Tossing sticks or bones to see how far you move is half chance, half ritual, and entirely addictive. You feel the suspense of each throw, the tilt of probability, the edge of anticipation, the laugh that escapes when fortune betrays you. The board glows faintly in the lamplight, squares catching the warmth of the flame. Around you, players argue cheerfully over moves. Someone claims their token was unfairly blocked, another insists the throw was invalid. The game is alive, not just as a relic, but as a shared pulse of community. Here, on the banks of the Nile, you understand. The invention of board games wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity, a way to weave structure into idle hours, to shape chance into ritual, and to keep nights from stretching too long and lonely. And as you lean back, watching the tokens dance across stone squares, you sense the faint echo of laughter that has lasted millennia. You lean in as the game begins, tokens lined up neatly in the first row. A hand tosses slender sticks onto the ground. They clatter softly. 4 pale slivers of wood marked on one side, blank on the other. These act like dice, deciding how many squares you move. The suspense is strangely familiar, like waiting for the spin of a roulette wheel or the roll of a 20-sided die. Mainstream history confirms that Senet blended chance and strategy. Players moved their pieces along the 30 squares, sometimes blocked by opponents, sometimes helped by lucky throws. The exact sequence is debated, but what's certain is that the game was captivating enough to survive millennia. Once you start, you don't want to stop. You're hooked, leaning forward to see if fortune will nudge you ahead or leave you stranded. The quirky tidbit: Egyptians sometimes nicknamed squares with dramatic titles: House of Rebirth, House of Happiness, even House of Water, where your token might get stuck as if bogged down in the Nile itself. Imagine your piece landing there, and your friend smugly declaring, "Sorry, you're in the House of Water. Try again next week." You'd groan, laugh, and swear never to trust those sticks again. Historians still argue whether these squares were symbolic add-ons introduced later or part of the original game design. Was Senet always meant to echo the soul's journey through trials? Or did priests retrofit religious meaning onto a popular pastime? The debate continues, like 2 players squabbling endlessly over whether house rules count as real rules. You shift closer to the players. Tokens clack against stone as they race down the board. One piece is trapped, unable to move past an opponent, and the player groans loudly while the others laugh. The tension builds, not with swords or politics, but with little cones of wood shuffled across painted squares. And as you sit there, you realize you've joined a lineage of spectators stretching back 5,000 years. People leaning forward, caught between luck, laughter, and the quiet thrill of a game under the Egyptian night. The board glows in lamplight, squares worn smooth from countless fingers, pushing tokens back and forth. But tonight, you notice something different. This isn't a game carved into mud or scratched on stone by children. This is a board fit for nobles, heavy wood inlaid with ivory and bright faience tiles, polished so carefully it gleams like water under the moon. Mainstream history shows that Senet was not only for the poor. Wealthy Egyptians commissioned elaborate boards, crafted by artisans who used precious materials to elevate the game into a symbol of prestige. Some boards folded into small boxes with drawers to store the pieces neatly. Practical, but also a quiet flex. Imagine inviting friends over for game night, then pulling out a custom-made, gold-inlaid Monopoly set. Subtlety was not the point. The quirky tidbit is this. Archaeologists found boards buried in the tombs of pharaohs themselves, including Tutankhamun. His set was so ornate, it looked more like a temple offering than a pastime. You imagine him leaning back in his palace chambers, playing under torchlight, while servants waited politely for him to finish gloating about a particularly lucky roll. Historians still argue whether these deluxe boards were functional or purely ceremonial. Did pharaohs actually play on them, or were they symbolic objects meant to guide souls through the afterlife? Some scholars insist that the intricacy of the craftsmanship suggests genuine use, while others think the boards were too precious, existing only as metaphors for eternity. You picture the scene, a noble reclining on cushions, a goblet of wine at his side, rolling sticks onto polished wood. The tokens glide smoothly, and the game stretches late into the night. Laughter rises, wagers are made, perhaps not for money, but for pride, favors, or even the last cup of wine. And here you realize something universal. Games, whether scratched in dirt or carved in ivory, have always carried the same undercurrent of competition. Whether you're a laborer sneaking moves during rest or a pharaoh reclining in luxury, the thrill of winning feels exactly the same. You step away from the gilded halls of nobles and drift instead toward the workmen's villages, those tight clusters of mud brick houses where stonecutters, potters, and bricklayers ended their long days. Here, the games are the same, but the boards look different. No ivory, no gilded boxes, just lines scratched into clay bricks or faint grooves carved into the edges of doorsteps. The glow of a small oil lamp illuminates two neighbors crouched low, their tokens nothing more than worn pebbles picked from the street. Mainstream history shows that board games weren't the preserve of the elite. Archaeologists have uncovered casual Senet grids carved into the surfaces of workers' huts, temple steps, even random walls. This suggests that after hours of grueling labor under the sun, Egyptians still had energy left for a round or two of playful strategy. Perhaps it wasn't luxury, it was necessity, a way to rest the mind even when the body was sore. The quirky tidbit? Some builders scratched quick game grids into bricks while they were still wet, letting the sun harden them into permanent boards. Imagine working on a construction site, setting aside a few minutes during lunch, and deciding to immortalize your love for board games in the very bricks of the building. Future generations would live, pray, or even get mummified surrounded by those casual doodles. Historians still argue whether these marks were spontaneous graffiti boards or deliberately built into houses to serve as permanent leisure spots. Did families gather around the same carved slab night after night? Or were these just idle marks that happened to resemble game boards? Either way, the scratches proved something essential. The love of play ran deep across every layer of Egyptian society. You picture the scene clearly, dusty hands still calloused from lifting stone, families huddled in the evening breeze, bread baking faintly in the corner while children giggle at each lucky throw. The game pieces clack softly, laughter rises, and for a moment, the hardship of daily toil fades into the background. The clatter you hear now is different, less the heavy thunk of tokens on stone, more the sharp rattle of dice that aren't really dice. Egyptians didn't always roll cubes like we do. They tossed slender sticks, knuckle bones, or even small carved pieces of wood to decide how many spaces a token could move. You pick up a set of throwing sticks, run your fingers along their smooth sides, and watch as they tumble across the floor, landing with some sides marked and others blank. The number of marks showing tells you the outcome. Simple, yes, but addictive enough to keep players hooked for hours. Mainstream history notes that Egyptians had multiple ways of generating chance. Knuckle bones, actually sheep ankle bones, were especially common, their uneven shapes giving them unpredictable rolls. They weren't just toys, they were also tools of divination, used to read luck as much as to move tokens. This dual role makes sense in a culture where daily life, play, and the divine were always entangled. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some Egyptians decorated their dice or bones with little faces or symbols, as if imbuing them with personalities. Imagine tossing a set of dice where one side is smiling smugly at you, daring you to lose. You'd almost want to blame the bone itself when luck turned sour. It's not me, it's that cheeky ankle bone again. Historians still argue whether the stick tossing in Senet was purely random, or if players tried to influence outcomes with technique. Did skilled hands tilt the odds by how they flicked the sticks, or was everything surrendered to chance? Archaeologists disagree, but you can picture one Egyptian accusing another of cheating throws, an argument still alive at modern game tables. The sound of sticks rattling blends with laughter and groans. Children cheer at improbable streaks of luck, while elders shake their heads knowingly, muttering about fortune's fickle nature. You take a turn, toss the sticks, and find yourself leaning forward instinctively, waiting for fate to reveal itself. And in that small clatter, the noise of bone and wood hitting stone, you realize something profound. The joy of not knowing, of surrendering to chance, is as old as civilization itself. The night air cools, and you follow the caravan of memory into a temple courtyard where shadows stretch long under torchlight. Here, the game boards don't look like casual scratches in mud brick walls. They gleam, carved into polished limestone benches, or inscribed on paving slabs that have borne centuries of feet. You realize this isn't just leisure anymore. It feels ceremonial, almost sacred. Mainstream history confirms that some Senate boards were found in temple complexes, including in Thebes, suggesting priests themselves may have played within religious settings. The dual role of games in Egypt, part pastime, part pathway to the gods, becomes clearer in places like these. In the temple glow, the game becomes more than fun. It transforms into a rehearsal for eternity. The quirky tidbit here is that graffiti-style boards scratched into sacred stone may have been done on the sly. Imagine a priest waiting for a ritual to begin, idly carving a grid into the step of a shrine, then returning later with a friend to play a holy round. Over time, this habit may have been sanctified, with the game reframed as a symbolic journey of the soul. It's the ancient equivalent of sneaking a round of solitaire at work, only to have the boss declare it a valuable meditation exercise. Historians still argue whether temple play was truly devotional or simply tolerated recreation. Were priests consciously treating Senet as a symbolic journey through the afterlife, or were they simply bored guardians of rituals, passing time with dice? The answer blurs across the centuries, much like the faded carvings still visible on temple steps. You sit against a column, listening to the murmurs of players debating moves. The game board flickers in the lamplight, pieces sliding as chants drift from an inner sanctuary. The boundary between ritual and recreation feels porous. One player whispers a prayer before tossing the sticks, while another chuckles as though nothing more is at stake than the evening's bragging rights. And in that mingling of devotion and diversion, you see the Egyptian genius, to weave the sacred into the ordinary, to let games carry both laughter and longing for eternity under the same night sky. The lamplight shifts now, and you step away from temple courtyards into the warmth of family homes. Mud brick walls hold the heat of the day, while a single clay lamp throws soft golden light across a low table. You crouch beside it, watching as parents and children lean over a board scratched into plaster, tokens clicking softly across the squares. This isn't the solemn game of priests. It's something far more familiar: family game night. Mainstream history shows that games like Senet were not confined to temples and tombs. They turned up in household spaces too, suggesting they were part of everyday life. Archaeologists have found small, portable boards tucked among cooking vessels and weaving tools, hinting that evenings by lamplight were filled not only with chores, but with play. The quirky tidbit is how these boards sometimes doubled as lids for storage boxes. You'd finish a game, sweep the tokens aside, and lift the board to reveal a compartment filled with jewelry, sewing tools, or, who knows, yesterday's leftover bread. Imagine a Monopoly board that also serves as your Tupperware lid. Ingenious, if slightly inconvenient when someone insists on playing while you're hungry. Historians still argue whether households treated Senet primarily as entertainment, or if it carried the same afterlife symbolism seen in tomb art. Did mothers teaching children the rules also whisper about gods and judgment? Or was it mostly, "No, you can't move there. Stop cheating"? The debate lingers like smoke from an oil lamp. You sit back and let the scene wash over you. The lamp flickers, shadows lean and stretch across the walls, and laughter bursts as someone makes a risky move. A child groans, another claps in triumph, and the tokens shuffle on. Beyond the walls, the Nile slides quietly through the night, but inside this small room, the world is condensed into 30 squares and the joy of playing together. As the night deepens, you drift from cozy homes to the bustle of inns and caravan stops, where travelers spread their belongings in small circles of lamplight. The air is thick with the smell of roasted fish and the faint tang of wine. Here, in the chatter of strangers and the shuffle of sandals, you notice another kind of board, one that looks both familiar and new. Mainstream history identifies it as mehen, sometimes called the game of the snake. Unlike Senet, with its neat rows of squares, this board coils like a serpent, curling into a spiral where tokens creep along its back. Archaeologists have found stone versions shaped like curled snakes, their scales carved as the spaces. The rules are lost to us, but the design alone suggests a playful imagination. Egyptians love to turn even their sacred symbols into games. The quirky tidbit is that some mihen boards came with tiny lion-shaped tokens, carved in bright stone or faience. Imagine prowling lions chasing marbles around a snake's back under torchlight, half children's toy, half cosmic metaphor. Historians joke that it was basically the world's first themed board game, ancient Egypt's version of a collector's edition. Yet historians still argue whether Mehen was played widely, or if it was already fading into ritual by the time Senet became dominant. Some think it was a household favorite in the Old Kingdom, gradually replaced, while others suggest it lingered as a niche curiosity long after. The debate leaves you picturing Egyptian kids squabbling over whether the snake game was cooler than Senet, an argument eerily similar to modern debates about video game consoles. You crouch near a group of weary traders rolling bones to decide turns. Their laughter rises, their voices blend, and for a moment the weariness of travel lifts. The game coils on, tokens moving, the serpent's back alive with play. And you realize that wherever Egyptians went, palace, village, caravan stop, they carried their boards like tiny worlds that unfolded in the quiet hours of night. You wander onward, and the laughter shifts. No longer the rough voices of traders or the murmurs of priests. Now it's higher, lighter, punctuated with squeals of delight and the occasional mock cry of defeat. You've stepped into a circle of children gathered around a simple board, the kind that could have been drawn in sand with a stick. Mainstream history tells us that Egyptian children played games not only to pass the time, but also to practice skills. Small versions of Senet or other counting games gave them chances to learn numbers, memory, and patience. Imagine sitting cross-legged with pebbles, learning arithmetic without realizing it. That's the ancient equivalent of educational apps, though with fewer glowing screens and more dust. The quirky tidbit here is that cheating appears to have been universal. Archaeologists studying wear patterns on boards suggest some players consistently adjusted pieces when no one was watching. Children, it seems, always had an uncanny talent for sly moves. You can almost picture a little girl sliding her token forward 2 extra squares when her brother turns his head, followed by a shriek of, "That's not fair." Some habits echo through eternity. Historians still argue whether these children's games were structured imitations of adult pastimes or if they had their own rules entirely. Was a kid's version of Senet meant to train them for the real game, or were they simply inventing simpler variations? The evidence is tantalizing but inconclusive, leaving modern scholars to play detective with fragments of boards and half-buried pawns. The children around you clap when one of their friends wins. The loser pouts, only to be pulled back in with a laugh and a promise of next round. Even in ancient Egypt, losing was temporary, and the joy of another try outweighed sulking. The lamplight glows on their faces, their tokens dance across crude squares, and you see the timelessness of play. The path shifts again, and now you're not in a courtyard or by the Nile. You're aboard a riverboat, sails catching the wind, water slapping softly against the hull. The deck is scattered with baskets, jars, and weary passengers, but amid the bustle, 2 men squat with a small wooden board balanced across their knees. Even here, far from home, the game comes along for the ride. Mainstream history reminds us that Egyptians were great travelers, by river, by desert caravan, even across the Mediterranean, and wherever they went, board games went with them. Archaeologists have uncovered portable Senet sets, compact boxes with drawers to hold tokens that must have been designed precisely for travel. Imagine a pharaoh's courier lugging grain receipts in one hand and a pocket-sized Senet board in the other. Practicality and play, side by side. The quirky tidbit, One set was carved onto the back of a cosmetic case, meaning someone carried makeup and a game in the same box. A two-in-one accessory millennia before the Swiss Army knife. Picture someone freshening up their eyeliner before declaring, "All right, let's play another round." Priorities, after all, don't change much. Historians still argue whether portable boards were luxuries for the wealthy or common among merchants. Did every trader on a Nile barge own one, or were they reserved for elites traveling with extra space in their baggage? Some say the small, simple boards scratched into wood suggest ordinary use, while the fancier travel boxes clearly belong to those with coin to spare. The board in front of you wobbles slightly as the boat rocks, tokens sliding precariously. One man steadies it with a laugh, accusing the other of trying to use the waves to his advantage. Around them, passengers lean in, grateful for distraction from the monotony of the journey. You realize that play doesn't stop for geography. Games are portable worlds, ready to be unfolded anywhere humans gather, whether on desert sands or the deck of a drifting boat. The boat drifts from view, and you find yourself back on solid ground, in a market quarter where incense coils in the air and chatter ripples through the streets. At one stall, alongside jars of honey and bolts of linen, you notice small carved tokens gleaming faintly in the light. These aren't ordinary playing pieces. Each one looks like a charm, shaped into protective symbols. Ankhs, scarabs, tiny falcons, or little discs etched with sacred eyes. Mainstream history tells us that gaming pieces in Egypt weren't always plain cones or spindles. Archaeologists have found sets crafted from precious stones, faience, even ivory, suggesting that the act of play carried symbolic weight. Some tokens were shaped to echo religious symbols, blending amusement with meaning. When you moved an ankh-shaped piece across the board, you weren't just chasing victory, you were nudging life itself, square by square. The quirky tidbit. Some players carried their gaming tokens on strings or tucked them into amulets. Imagine slipping your favorite senet piece into a pouch around your neck, both lucky charm and insurance for the afterlife. It's the original version of bringing your dice set to every game night, swearing they roll better than anyone else's. Historians still argue whether these decorated pieces were talismans first and game tokens second, or vice versa. Were they designed to enhance play, or was the game itself simply another avenue for invoking divine favor? The ambiguity makes you wonder if Egyptians believed fortune could literally be carried in your pocket. You sit cross-legged in a shadowed corner as players lay out their tokens. They whisper a prayer before tossing sticks, fingers brushing carved scarabs as if coaxing luck from stone. The game proceeds, but each move feels charged. Half strategy, half superstition. In this mingling of chance and charm, you see how Egyptians blurred the lines between magic and leisure, finding in both a way to make the night feel just a little safer. The market stalls fade, and you drift into the wide avenues where foreign merchants arrive with their wares, donkeys laden with jars, carts stacked with cloth, and sailors shouting greetings in tongues you only half recognize. Egypt, for all its grandeur, was never isolated. Goods, people, and ideas flowed in and out, and with them came games that looked strangely familiar, yet carried accents from abroad. Mainstream history records that contact with Mesopotamia and the Levant influenced Egyptian play. Boards like the Royal Game of Ur from Mesopotamia, with its patterned squares and racing pieces, echo faintly in Egypt's own designs. Some scholars suspect that Egyptian travelers borrowed ideas, tweaking them into new forms. Games moved along trade routes as easily as spices or copper. Here's the quirky tidbit. Archaeologists found a fragmentary board in the Sinai Peninsula that seems to blend elements of Egyptian Senet with Mesopotamian racing games. It's as if some ancient player mashed two favorites together into a hybrid, half Nile, half Euphrates. You imagine someone proudly explaining, "This is my custom edition," while neighbors roll their eyes. Historians still argue whether these cross-cultural games were truly imports or simply parallel inventions. Did Egyptians see a Mesopotamian board and copy it? Or did similar human impulses, boredom, competition, the joy of chance, produce similar games independently? The debate remains lively, but the boards themselves whisper of mingling, of ideas crossing deserts and seas. You picture the scene. A Phoenician sailor sets down a board with tiny shell inlays, showing an Egyptian farmer how to move tokens across the patterned track. Laughter bridges the language gap. Frustration over bad rolls becomes universal, and soon enough, the game belongs to both. In that moment, you realize games were not just entertainment. They were diplomacy in miniature, softening the edges of foreignness square by square. The sounds of the bustling port fade, and you find yourself in a quieter courtyard, shaded by palm fronds. Here the mood is not noisy or playful, but contemplative. A small group of scribes, their reed pens tucked behind their ears, lean over a board. They're not laughing or shouting. Instead, they murmur like philosophers puzzling out the meaning of life. Except they're puzzling over dice and tokens. Mainstream history shows that Egyptian elites often treated games as metaphors for order, fate, and the balance between chaos and stability. Senet, in particular, became linked to the soul's passage through the afterlife, where each throw represented a test of fortune. This connection wasn't universal, but it left its mark in tomb art and funerary texts. For some, rolling sticks was not just chance. It was destiny rehearsed in miniature. The quirky tidbit is that some ancient texts seem to describe game moves alongside prayers, as if invoking gods to bless the outcome. Imagine combining Monopoly with a hymn book, rolling the dice while chanting to secure divine approval for your railroad purchases. The line between sacred devotion and silly competition blurred until no one was quite sure which mattered more. Historians still argue whether Egyptian thinkers genuinely saw games as cosmic lessons, or if later generations projected this meaning onto them. Were philosophers actually debating the theology of Senet, or were they just sore losers pretending their loss was symbolically significant? The question remains unresolved, like an eternal tie. You sit close enough to hear their whispers. One insists the board mirrors the journey of Ra's sunboat through the underworld, while another chuckles, saying it's nothing more than a clever way to waste an evening. The pieces move slowly, thoughtfully, each toss weighed as if it might tip the scales of eternity. And here you understand that in Egypt, games weren't trivial distractions. They were puzzles, mirrors, meditations, tiny squares that carried the weight of philosophy, even when played under the hum of cicadas and the soft glow of the moon. The night draws long, and you find yourself standing before the still silence of a tomb. Cool air slips from the stone chamber, carrying the faint smell of dust and eternity. Inside, amid jars of grain, jewelry, and carved furniture, rests something that feels almost out of place. A board game, tokens neatly arranged as if the deceased might wake at any moment to play. Mainstream history confirms that Senet boards were buried with the dead, a tradition so consistent it's impossible to dismiss. Pharaohs, nobles, and even ordinary officials took their boards into the afterlife, ensuring that play continued where breath did not. The game became a metaphor for crossing the trials of death. each square a stepping stone toward peace. The quirky tidbit is that some boards were inscribed directly with prayers from the Book of the Dead. Imagine rolling your sticks and seeing not only numbers, but also little reminders. Do not fall into the lake of fire. Talk about raising the stakes for family game night. These boards weren't just entertainment. They were maps of salvation in miniature. Historians still argue whether the deceased were imagined as literally playing Senet in the afterlife, or if the boards were symbolic tools, never meant to be touched again. Was the pharaoh expected to sit down and throw sticks with Osiris himself? Or was the presence of the board enough to signify safe passage? The answer remains hazy, a game with rules forever half forgotten. You trace your fingers over the carved squares, faint grooves smoothed by centuries. The board lies silent now, but you can almost hear echoes of laughter, groans of defeat, cheers of victory. Egyptians believed that to play was to prepare, and to prepare was to endure forever. And as you stand in that quiet chamber, the weight of time pressing all around, you realize that games were never trivial here. They were woven into life and death alike, carrying players across evenings, across generations, and across eternity itself. Now the tomb fades, the lamplight softens, and the tokens fall still. The echoes of dice and laughter dissolve into the quiet of your own room. You've walked through Nile courtyards, temple steps, noisy inns, and silent chambers, following the boards and sticks wherever they appeared. And through it all, the Egyptians have shown you something simple yet profound, that play is as eternal as stone. Let your breathing slow now, as steady as the Nile's current. Imagine the gentle clack of tokens on a board, soft as rain on clay. The game is no longer urgent, no longer contested. It drifts, patient, timeless. Every move has been made, every square traveled, and now the board waits quietly in the dark. Your body grows heavier, more at ease, as though you've set down the pack of a long journey. The flickering lamplight dims, leaving only warmth and the faint hum of night. Each breath carries you further from the noise of play and closer to calm. Picture yourself lying beneath the stars of Egypt, the desert cool at last, the Nile whispering its endless lullaby. Around you, the ancient players sleep too, their boards tucked away, their laughter folded gently into history. The game is finished, the night is safe, and tomorrow will wait patiently for you to rise again. Close your eyes, sink into that stillness, and let the tokens of thought scatter softly away. There are no rules left to follow, no moves to make, only rest